Good evening. Thank you for joining us. My name is Dennis Mason with LaRouchepack.com. This is the regular Friday evening webcast featuring Mr. LaRouche. Joining me in the studio this evening are Matthew Ogden and Leander Bernstein to ask the questions. And without any further introduction, I'll give you Mr. Lyndon Larouche.
In the recent week, I have completed probably what is the most important piece of scientific work ever done by me, and certainly probably all our associates. So you will find that in my responses today to any questions given, that factor will be taken into account. So I now leave it over to the people to introduce me otherwise.
Well, I would like to present the first question, as is probably on the minds of our audience, and people will be curious to see what your response will be regarding what you just said. The first question pertains to the news that President Obama, has officially decided to send military aid to the rebels in Syria to arm the opposition against Assad in Syria. This decision came with the announcement by Deputy National Security Advisor Ben Rhodes that this week, lo and behold, the White House has concluded that Syria's Assad government has used chemical weapons against its own people, which is Obama's so-called red line. Obviously, as you have repeatedly said, this has nothing to do with Syrian rebels, but this has everything to do with sparking World War III. And this war would be one involving the United States, Britain, and allies on the one hand, and Russia primarily as the major actor on the other, something which mankind very well would not survive. And this is also something which the Joint Chiefs of Staff have known all along, and have, for that reason, Dempsey and others, repeatedly done everything possible to block such an escalation. Now, the immediate response from Russia is typified by two statements. The first came from Yuri Ushakov, who is an advisor to President Putin and was the former ambassador to the United States. Ushakov said, the Americans tried to present us with the information on the use of chemical weapons by the regime, but frankly, we thought that it was not convincing. We wouldn't like to invoke references to the famous lab tube that former Secretary of State Colin Powell used, referencing the false intelligence that got us into the Iraq War, but the facts don't look convincing in our eyes. Of course, this will not help in the preparation of the International Geneva Conference if the Americans actually initiate larger-scale support for the rebels. And the second comment came from Alexei Pushkov, who is the head of the Russian Duma's Foreign Relations Committee, who said, information about the use by Assad of chemical weapons has been fabricated in the same place as the lies about Saddam Hussein's weapons of mass destruction. Obama is taking the same path as George W. Bush. And so we know that this absolutely is the case. And the comments about the parallels to Iraq and the weapons of mass destruction are fully appropriate, including the reference to where the fabrication of this intelligence came from, which is directly from London. The case of Blair in the Iraq War, and now the case of Cameron and Haig today. Haig was in the United States directly before the announcement of the arming of the Syrian rebels, and Cameron is pushing ravenously for others to join in. Now, even Zbigniew Brzezinski has weighed in on this on the side of sanity, saying this is pure wartime propaganda, denouncing this as a policy which will rapidly escalate, calling for an international coalition to be built involving the United States together with Russia and China and even the Japanese, and said that working with Qatar and Saudi Arabia in the name of promoting democracy is a ridiculous idea at best. So my question for you is, what is your analysis of this situation? What is your response to the moves that have been taken by the Obama administration and London?
No one has certainty on this present situation. No one has certainty. What you have is you have a stooge, Obama, so-called President Obama. I say so-called advisedly, because I don't think he runs anything. I think he's a snarling beast, incapable of real reason, who is simply an instrument of London. That's all he is. Now, as to what the situation is, now he has already taken a step, or announced a step, whoever told him to do it, which leads toward, in a very short time, in a countdown, to thermonuclear war, which means a war in which, at the crucial point of development of that war, you have about 1 hour and a half at most to finish off the human species in a thermonuclear war. So that's where we are. Now, what this means on the side of the British, and it's the British Queen and her circles which are really the authors of this war. The evidence is there. The plan was from the Queen, who said it publicly repeatedly, that her policy to effect the reduction of the population of the planet from the 7 billion people to about 1. The Queen is already implementing that policy. She becomes the greatest would-be mass murderer in the history of mankind. She is now very sick, which means that she might not make it. But that doesn't change anything, really, because this is the question of the empire. And empires go on, and this empire is a very long one. The most recent season of this empire goes back into the 17th century, when the Anglo-Dutch operation, and still the Dutch, is not the British Empire, it's the Anglo-Dutch Empire. And the heritage of the monarchy is entirely Dutch. And if you pay any attention to history, modern history, since World War II, the close relationship between the British monarchy and the Dutch monarchy has been the actual force of evil leading most of the problems of the world today. And it still is. So the President of the United States is really nothing but a dummy. A nasty dummy, no brain power shown, and no decency shown. He's a wreckage, piece of wreckage. But now the process goes on. We have two ways we can go. Either we can avoid this thermonuclear war, which means we have to shut down Obama, not because Obama is actually effective. He's only an instrument. But if the instrument is pulled, then the British Empire is out of the picture. So that's where we stand. So we have no decision either way. You can't call the shot either way. You have to call it both ways. It's either or. Either we stop Obama, stop him cold, throw him out of office. And there are signs of preparations for exactly that right now. On the other side, you have the British Empire, or the British Dutch Empire, to put it clearly, which is the part that wants the war, wants the killing. Now, if you observe that the Queen has been engaged, and the Dutch even more so, in murder. The Dutch monarchy is the most murderous monarchy in Europe. If you are, say, reach the age of 70, and you sneeze in Dutch territory, they'll rush you to a hospital and give you last rest. That's the way they do it. The Dutch monarchy is the most murderous thing I know of on the continent of Europe. And this is the same thing as the British. The Queen has made her policy. She assembled all the people of her supporters in Britain, the leading supporters, again and again, since the Copenhagen period. And our policy is reduce rapidly the human population from 7 billion people to approximately 1. And they are presently doing that. Obama is presently doing that as an agent of that. And the British monarchy is presently doing that to reduce the population of the planet rapidly from 7 billion to about 1. And if they go ahead with the kind of game that the British and the Wall Street crowd are pushing, you will find that very soon, not sometime a year ahead, but this year, you will find genocide in the form of absolute starvation will be already rapidly wiping out most of our American citizens and others relevant. So the question is, do we have in the United States, do we have enough leaders in government who are not cowards or not scumbags, as we call them, to defend the people of the United States against what has been repeatedly, Wall Street has done repeatedly. Wall Street is the enemy of the human race.
Well, let me ask a question, a second question, which I think is very pertinent to the points that you just made. At the same time, Obama had called the huddle inside the White House to make the decision to escalate the situation in Syria. His world was falling apart around him. I'll remind our viewers that at this time last week, during the Friday webcast that we had previous to this one, the news had just broken of the leaks that had been published in The Guardian and The Washington Post about the unprecedented extent of the surveillance state that is being presided over by this president, with the information on the NSA wiretapping and mass trolling, mass dragnet of all of the communications, both telephone and internet, of American citizens. You said at that point last week that we are really on the edge. At this point, the choice is clear. It's either impeach Obama now or face overt dictatorship. What you said is that we've come to a point where Obama has such brutally abused the United States and its citizens and its economy in every imaginable way. There is now a sudden revolt that we have on our hands, and the question is, which comes first? The impeachment of this president or the overt move for direct dictatorship? Now, since that point, there's been a lot that's come in the wake of the revelations of the NSA spying, which obviously was not an isolated scandal, but came in the context of everything else that's been on Obama's plate. Benghazi, the lies surrounding that, the IRS targeting of political enemies, and so forth. Daniel Ellsberg, who was the famous publisher of the Pentagon Papers, responded to the publication of the NSA wiretapping by saying this proves that the United States is now becoming the United Stasi of America, to a point which would make the Stasi, or the secret police of East Germany, green with envy. Now, in the beginning of this week, what was the major discussion is that not only is this an unconstitutional practice, but this is an anti-constitutional practice. This goes at the very heart of what inspired the American Revolution. It was the writs of assistance and the general warrants that were issued by the British royal governors against the people of Massachusetts, undiscriminatory for search and seizure, that inspired the authorship of the Founding Fathers of the Fourth Amendment and the other guarantees of American liberties. Now, this was the major subject of a press conference that I had the opportunity to attend on Capitol Hill yesterday, which was hosted by Senator Rand Paul, together with a nonpartisan group of others at the podium, Representatives Amash, Massey, Mulvaney, Gomert, and Sanford, also with representatives of the ACLU. And they were announcing the Fourth Amendment Restoration Act of 2013, which Senator Paul is entering, an act to stop the National Security Agency from spying on citizens of the United States, which is joined by a bipartisan bill on the House side from Justin Amash of Michigan and Democrat John Conyers, which would have the similar effect. So during the remarks that were made by not only Senator Paul, but also the congressman and the constitutional scholar Bruce Fine, the references were made repeatedly to the violations of liberty that the British royal governors perpetrated before the American Revolution. And the question was posed, have we reached the point now where there's the courage to stand up to defend the principles that this republic was founded on, or have we reached the day in which the American Republic was lost? So, your comments.
Well, the question is whether the members of Congress who act on one occasion or another as gutless wonders and crawling, creeping things, and sometimes show a little guts on an issue, they've got to make up their mind whether the crawlies or the gutless the gutless wonders or whatever they are, because what you have the current legislation, which is highly debated in the Congress now and in those circles now, and that thing shows the votes of members of the Congress, absolutely gutless wonders beyond belief, who actually are supporting a measure which leads toward the extermination of most Americans. And I don't mean the long term, I mean the short term. Because this policy that's been pushed through on this crazy legislation, which is cooked up legislation, is fraudulent. It violates the Constitution. You do not have to stop until you get clearance against a violation of the Constitution. And what Obama has done, or has been done in his name, in behalf of Wall Street, is a violation of the Constitution. Now, somebody in this operation, if it's not the Congress, the Chief Justices of the United States must act to expel or condition the expulsion of Obama from office. It has to be done now. And members of the Senate and members of the Congress who will not vote against the bill, which is operating, the one that's contentious now, if they don't actually throw this thing out, and then their idea of being legal is treason. Sometimes legality is treason. And this is one of the times when people are supporting that damn action. So therefore, we need an angel of mercy to relieve us from those members of Congress who don't know how to vote properly.
Well, this question gets to an issue of a law as it's presented on paper in words, as opposed to the policy that's represented in action, indeed, in fact. I'll let our viewers in on a little secret, and that's a discussion that you had with some of your associates last night, where you indicated that you were disappointed with the handling of the Glass-Steagall organizing, how we were organizing around Glass-Steagall. Now, in part, I think that is a result of the discovery that you indicated you made with the writing of your most recent paper, which will soon be available on the website, called Cusa, Kepler, and Shakespeare. But as a result of that, we can't downplay what we have already accomplished. And just as a quick review, we have 22 state legislatures, state bodies, who have introduced Glass-Steagall resolutions, most recently New York and New Jersey. We have international petitions that continue to come in, international appeals from all over the world, most recently on our website, a message from Mr. Daisuke Kodegawa, a former IMF representative from Japan, a former official with the finance ministry in Japan. And what's most typical is a response that we have to our interventions in the nation's capital, where at an event earlier this week, a congressman was asked a question on where he stands on Glass-Steagall, and he said, every day I see activists between Longworth and the Cannon office buildings, but I'm just not sure if we can go back to that policy. But every day I see activists out there, and they have a point. But the question that continues to come up in organizing in D.C., all over the country, is whether we're going to use the United States government to backstop the fake values of the financial system, or whether we're going to throw those values out as fictitious. And just this week you had a very interesting development which establishes a more devastating context for this fight for Glass-Steagall, where the House of Representatives voted 301 to 124 to pass the Swap Jurisdiction Certainty Act. Now, for those of you who speak English, this act would exempt foreign arms of U.S. banks from new regulations on derivatives which were written into the Dodd-Frank Act. So if you're a foreign bank operating inside the United States, you can do whatever your thieving heart desires under the passage of this law. And there were further revelations this week, including that a certain Federal Reserve governor announced that quantitative easing would go on indefinitely, because apparently if Ben Bernanke sneezes so as to indicate that quantitative easing might be scaled back, the markets go into a nosedive. Also, there were findings published on a reputable blog site, Zero Hedge, demonstrating that more than any other bank, more than any group of banks in the entire United States, the Federal Reserve was lent more money in the first quarter of this year than all other banks combined. Lending has virtually seized up entirely to the real economy. We know this clearly, but even more so, what was demonstrated in the release by the Fed is that more than half of that lending went to foreign branches or foreign banks in the United States. So this, in addition to the exposure of the expansive rate rigging of foreign exchange rates, which these rates were manipulated and used to set the values of trillions of dollars of investments, including those foreign exchange derivatives that were just let off the hook by this vote in the U.S. House of Representatives. So you have a complete unrestrained mess, a disaster in the U.S. financial sector, but at the same time, you have the agreement, the tacit agreement, by members of Congress who we speak to, or who have added their names to the legislation to reinstate Glass-Steagall, saying, I agree with Glass-Steagall, I support Glass-Steagall, yet every time an opportunity comes up to curb the excesses of Wall Street, the words turn out to be just that, words. So I'd like you to address exactly what is happening in this fight and how we break through the words, the agreement, to get to action.
Okay. There's some simple things and some complicated things. The simple things are the most important. The complicated things are what you pick up the pieces afterward. First of all, as long as we continue to honor what these claims to be, the banking systems claims, with all this legislation for it, this stuff is worthless. It has no honest claim. These amounts have no honest claim against the population in general of the United States. If the law is rightly informed, all the wealth of all those speculators and banks and so forth is simply worthless, and everyone can blow it away with their own breath. The problem is that the forces of the United States government and the banking systems as such are maintaining laws which are unlawful. They're absolutely contrary to the Constitution. They are a violation of the law of the United States in every respect. If a fair law is enforced, they are dead. Not biologically, though they might take their own lives in another case. But the debt, the unpayable debt, the never payable debt, which this section of the international banking system represents, could never be redeemed. And the intention is not to redeem it. The intention is to kill a lot of Americans and others. Therefore, unless you pass Glass-Steagall, you ain't doing nothing. If you enact Glass-Steagall, that's shut down. Those banks are wiped out, which they should be wiped out because they could never redeem the claims against them. They could never redeem. They don't intend to redeem. Look at what's happened, the perpetual expansion of a worthless debt as a claim against the nations. This is the key to thermonuclear war. If you don't want to die in a thermonuclear war, because some nations are not going to honor this so-called debt, therefore they'll stand up rather than die needlessly. If they're going to die in battle. They're not going to die any other way. Not some parts of the planet. So therefore, if anyone's got a brain in their head, they're going to put in Glass-Steagall immediately. Because Glass-Steagall immediately cancels everything of this crap. We don't care if these banks go bankrupt. We don't need these banks. They're worthless anyway. Take the denominated debt of these banks. Take the rate of growth of that debt to quadrillion range. Quadrillion range. As against the relatively meager claims of the banks themselves. They're hopelessly bankrupt. The normal law demands that they be bankrupted. When a bank is in a situation where it's already hopelessly bankrupt, could never pay the debt, then the proper action of government is to shut them down. It's the obligation of government to shut them down. They're national or international, makes no difference. Shut them down. We don't need them. If you give me the authority, I could fix this quickly. No problem. We just take those institutions, banking institutions, which are not crumb bums, which these are. The federal government gives these banks which survive and deserve to survive, defends it fully, and creates a matted credit system in order to finance a recovery of the U.S. economy, to put people back to work, to give them their jobs, and to give them the hope of the future. Our job is to defend the people of the United States and its people. The present government is destroying the people, destroying all their rights, taking all their rights away, killing them. And our government can do nothing to defend the lives of our people against these swindlers, the greatest swindlers known to mankind. They should be bankrupted, and there's only one way to do it. Pass Glass-Steagall now. Any member of Congress that is not voting for Glass-Steagall's immediate installation is a coward and a traitor.
Well, we've discussed now the empire of war, the empire of money. Since you mentioned it in the beginning of the webcast, and since this piece will be available for viewers of LaRouche PAC very soon, I want to ask you a question about the empire of the mind. Mm-hmm. You've elaborated very clearly in the report that you've just published, Cusa, Kepler, and Shakespeare, what was actually genius, that the decline of the United States, especially since the death of President Roosevelt, has brought us to the point of existential threat to the future of mankind. And we've reached a point where the stupidity of people in general is almost a suffocating pressure on the individuals, the very few individuals who might be creative. Now, you very provocatively have taken the juxtaposition between two contemporaries, Johannes Kepler and William Shakespeare, who lived in similar times and perceptibly might have been dealing in differing fields. However, you've said that William Shakespeare has elaborated a scientific principle which has not been in a more precise form than perhaps any other scientist aside from Kepler himself and Kepler's forebearer, Nicholas of Cusa. But he elaborated it in the form of his entire canon of dramas, but most especially King Henry V, with the role of the character that Chorus plays. The essential section in which you elaborate this point in this report is Section 1, A Thesis, the Human Mind. And I have just a question that maybe you can elaborate a little bit more fully. With the domain of what we could call sense uncertainty or unreality, the shadow world that you describe as the projection of merely shadows cast, which most human beings would perceive as real, as reality. However, you say in King Henry V, Shakespeare has penetrated something which gets to a fundamental principle of human psychology, the difference between truth and sense certainty. That the question presented by Shakespeare is to ask the question of what the mere shadow is a shadow of what it actually is not. And you pose the question of the ontologically distinct yet coexisting functions of the superior human mind to what is merely the human brain, which are distinctly separate but interactive, you say, and find themselves in a circumstance of conflict with each other. So I wondered if you could say more.
I could say a bit on this because it's a very large subject, as you know, and you've had access to the full text of it. But the basic thing is, what is the difference between humanity and animals? That's the essential point. And to understand that, you have to understand a number of other things to show how that works and why it works that way. But what you're dealing with as Shakespeare, see, Shakespeare introduced in King Henry V a new concept which was essentially pedagogical. The notion that this power of insight is restricted to the creative intellect of the human being. Now, the related question is, what about the animals? The animals are not human. What does that mean? Well, it means they're not human. But what is it about the animals which makes them unhuman? The fact that the human species is the only known living species known to us presently, which is capable of actual intellectual creativity. That does not mean that animals cannot be clever, but they cannot change the laws by which they operate. And that's the difference. Now, the point is, mankind, and what Shakespeare did with his Henry V was to make that distinction very clear. And he did it by saying that what people believe from experience is foolishness. What they think they experience from that is foolishness. They don't know what they're doing. Therefore, there's some people who understand that what human creativity means. That the human mind, when properly developed, is capable of actual creativity. That is, instead of being working on the basis of what they know, their experience, and trying to draw conclusions from that experience, they make leaps. Leaps of discovery which the animal cannot make. In other words, the idea that a gradual experience is what gives you more intelligence may be true for animals, but it's not really creativity. Only the human mind is capable of the leaps in discovery. And the fact of the matter is also, and this will probably stump some of our listeners and viewers and so forth, but the fact is that the leap occurs in the human mind. The human mind is the only mind that can do this. No animal can invent a new principle. The characteristic of the human individual, which makes them creative, if they are creative, and most human beings are not able to be creative because they're conditioned to be stupid. They think they know everything. They think they've learned everything, but they know nothing new. They may know something new in the sense of novelty, but not new in the sense of a principle. Therefore, the distinction of man, let's take the animals, for example, the animal kingdom in general, living processes. They do evolve. They make leaps. The species makes a leap to a higher level, often in many cases. A species dies out, but is replaced by a higher version of the same thing. A revolution has occurred. So the point is that while the animal can biologically make a leap in species characteristics, mankind is the only species that can make a leap without having to become a different species. And that's the essence. The whole thing is laid out in this thing, which takes some time to go through. But that's the essence of the matter. Mankind has a potential, if we exercise it, which no other living creature on this planet or any place else we know can do. The universe evolves progressively. That's the general function of the universe, unless they blow up. Whole parts of the universe blow up at times. Like the sun, for example, 2 billion years from now, the sun will have blown up. And we have got to improve ourselves to be capable of moving away from that joint before it does blow up. And it's going to blow up before the 2 billion years, because it's going to change its character and become very nasty. So we human beings have to use our creativity to develop new things, new ways of doing things. We are not going to go to Mars to live on, not if I have a sense of it, because there's no way we can maintain life of human beings on Mars under present conditions. We would have to change Mars first. Now, at some point, human beings should be able to create a change in Mars and in other ways. We're going to go to the moon anyway, if we have any brains at all. We're not going to live on the surface of the moon. That's only nuts would do that. If you're going to live on the moon, even for a short period of time, you're going to dig down deep underneath there. otherwise you're not going to make it. But this is what we're coming to. The point is, the way we've educated people in this society, in general, they don't know what it is to be human. You have some people like Vernadsky, for example. Vernadsky is a true genius. He was a true genius in the matters of life and similar things like that. You have had people like that. Nicholas LaRouche was a genius, one of the greatest geniuses that humanity has ever known. And his follower, was not an immediate follower because there was some time distance there. So this kind of thing that exists. We human beings, if we are properly conditioned to do so, have a power of voluntary creativity which no other species known to us has. And the human mind, when properly developed and encouraged, is capable of making discoveries which can willfully change the character of Earth, willfully change the order of the solar system. That can happen. It should be our mission and intent to do that. Because the sun is very nasty, can be very nasty, and it is not going to last the 2 billion years which some people have scheduled for existence before it blows up. It will become absolutely intolerable much earlier. So therefore, we have to develop higher powers per capita for controlling the forces of Earth and the forces in the solar system. That's the difference of man. And that's the nobility of man. And what you have is a society in which everybody except a few, the oligarchy, are kept down, intellectually, crushed. They are creative people, but they're not allowed to be creative. They go to schools where they're taught not to be creative, but only mimics of something or other. And therefore, the question which you've opened up here is way beyond the range of this particular session at this time. But I could give him some indications. That's where it goes. There is in man a power of creativity, true creativity, which is not known to us as existing in any living form of animal life. Unfortunately, only a tiny minority, still a minority, which has actually developed a conscious knowledge of what creativity is. Most people have no idea of what creativity is. They use the word creativity because they don't know what it is. If they knew what it was, they wouldn't call it creativity. And that's my specialty. And that's the specialty of a limited number, unfortunately, of people on this planet who actually have that capability. And for Max Planck, for example, Einstein, for example, there are people, there have been, like Nicholas LaRouche, like Kepler, Bach, for example. Bach is a creative individual. You don't think he invented notes to you. And so all the greatest artists, the greatest thinkers known to us of mankind have this same quality, the same dedication. And what's needed is to defend what mankind is potentially for the sake of what it is for a tiny minority of the population. And stop this bestialization of mankind, which is the dominant feature of the situation now.
You're not going to get off the hook that easy. And I would again like to warn our viewers, in a sense, that when Mr. LaRouche says that this piece of writing that he just completed and will be published very shortly, that it's the best piece of writing he's done, don't expect an easy read, and don't expect to keep your temper if you're being honest with the subject matter. Unless you're a creative genius. But the subhead of your recent paper is what was actually genius. And the question for you is not what was actually genius, but why. And you started to address that in your last response. But we can discuss at length the problems with society today, the decline of society as you've pinpointed it since the death of Franklin Roosevelt, and even worse since the assassination of John Kennedy and his brother Robert. We can look at what's happened with the economy. We can look at what's happened socially with the incredibly sorry state of mass education, with the horrifying state of popular entertainment, of music, which with the onset of the counterculture of the 1960s, it was sex, drugs, and rock and roll. Today, it's sex, drugs, and death. Mm. And that's increasingly the environment that young people, older people have been exposed to. That is the environment that they've been cultivated within, that their minds have been cultivated within. And we've had dark ages in the past. Humankind has survived dark ages in the past, and that's not to encourage people to hope for some wonderful outcome that they might survive through a dark age. But what's interesting is you've had the periods of Renaissance, and some of the figures who have launched the great periods of Renaissance, Socrates, Plato, Jesus Christ, for example, Nicholas of Cusa, Johannes Kepler, these people did not exactly live in the most opportune social conditions. I mean, you take the example, Jesus Christ. I mean, that he was in the heart of the Roman Empire. That was not exactly the best of times, but became the foundation for renaissances of the future. Became the foundation for human society in the future. So I'd like to ask you this question. Why is it there have been so few geniuses? If it's the case, and you've asserted this in many places, and it's something that a lot of people will positively agree with you on, that every human being is born with an innate human creativity. Why is it the case that humanity, thus far, has created so few geniuses?
Well, actually, we have had great success in the United States, even beginning with the Mayflower operation, which I'm a descendant of. So I take pride in that. All right, so the point is that what's happened actually is we've had episodes of sliding down, destruction. Most of the destruction of the United States has actually been caused by the Anglo-Dutch imperial force. Virtually everything since the beginning of the 17th century has been a result of the Anglo-Dutch imperialism. William of Orange, etc. The most evil thing that ever slithered across the continent of Europe and beyond. So therefore, we now have come to a time, we've got bounced back between dark ages and renaissances of various degrees. For example, Germany was in a mess until Bismarck. And when Bismarck reacted in the end of that decade, then he created a new Germany with a high accomplishment, a general accomplishment of the population in general. Then, of course, what they destroyed that with dumping Bismarck. And the dumping of Bismarck led to this silliness of the German, because when Bismarck was kicked out of office, that's when World War I started, actually. And that was in 1890. And then from that point on, you have a remorseless, unstoppable war called the First World War, which spilled over into the 1920s. We then had a relief with Franklin Roosevelt. And as long as Roosevelt was president, we were on the way to victory. But the minute Roosevelt died, And Truman and company were among those just waiting for him to die so they could start the war they wanted to do. If you look at the policy of peace, under this, Franklin, Roosevelt, and you look at the change with the introduction of this piece of pork called Truman, and you find this on a slide, we find resistance. The Kennedy brothers were a factor of resistance, typify resistance. But then we started the Indochina War. And since the beginning of the Indochina War, the United States has been going to hell, first by inches, then by foot, then by yard, then by miles, and so forth. So the population of the American population today is morally derelict compared to the generation of my age, of my youth. And that's the big problem. We have a degeneration, a moral, intellectual degeneration of the population of the United States. So that if we don't get the United States back now, the young generation coming up now will destroy the nation anyway. So that's the issue. You have to do it. Because if you keep this policy going, and what's allowed, look at the people who are my age as a young man, they don't exist anymore to speak of. And the younger ones who aren't in that category aren't fit to lead, except very rare cases of people who actually have the guts and brains to do what's necessary. Most of our members of Congress are cowards, stinking cowards. They have no depth of commitment at all. What we have now is they are now those people who are generally gutless. And you see repeatedly with votes and vote after vote in the Congress, you have a gutless Congress, a gutless Wonders Assembly, not a Congress. And what we cannot now, at this point, turn the tide away from what has happened since Franklin Roosevelt died. If we can't turn that tide now, mankind may be finished. And that's what I'm concerned about. And I know I make no mistake. I make no exaggeration in any degree on this issue. I'm right, and anybody who thinks I'm not right, they're wrong.
All right, well, that brings a conclusion to tonight's broadcast. I'd like to thank Matthew Ogden and Leander Bernstein for joining us, and thank you very much, Lynn. And thank you all for joining us. Good night.